Alrighty, welcome to the female reproductive system. Now we're going to concentrate on what's happening hormonally. So hormonal regulation. The picture here on the right is given to you from your book. It goes through step by step what is being secreted from what and what that does downstream, and positive and negative feedback for each of those. Super helpful to run through and read. I'm not going to go through that one by one, but feel free to do that on your own time. I would encourage you to make your own version of this too in order for you to really understand it. Let's kind of talk about in general what's happening. So just like with males, we talked about GnRH, and we talked about how GnRH goes in pulses, and for males, we talked about how that goes every 60 to 90 minutes, kind of like this. And then every 60 to 90 minutes, we have big GnRH. GnRH tells anterior pituitary, GnRH tells anterior pituitary, hey, make FSH and LH. Anterior pituitary does that, then we finally get a negative feedback once we have enough FSH and LH to go back to the anterior pituitary and say, hey, we've got enough, like, stop it, and then 90 minutes later we do this again. So for females it's different because this isn't, we're not continuously producing oocytes, and we need to have a systematic way of producing one really good oocyte every 28 days. So instead of it being every 60 to 90 minutes, it's a little different. And it still goes in pulses, just not every 60 to 90 minutes. It usually goes in a set of hours, but we don't expect you to know that, so don't worry about that for females. Just know that it still goes in pulses. It's just a longer set of pulses, or longer set of time in between each pulse for females. Okay, so what changes this pulse? Estrogens will increase the pulse frequency. So if we have a lot of estrogens, it'll say, hey, hypothalamus, we haven't made, we've made enough estrogen, and so we don't need any more estrogen, so cut it out. So high GnRH pulse frequencies are going to prevent the cycle from continuing. Progesterone will also decrease the GnRH pulses. So if you have too low of a GnRH pulse frequency, again, you're also going to stop the cycle. So there has to be the sweet spot somewhere in the middle where GnRH is being released somewhere in between too high and too low in order for the cycle to continuously be happening. Why am I being so vague and generic? Because it's different for everyone. I don't even know if we actually have really good data on this. I bet a fertility specialist does, but I'm not aware of what those time points are. What's really interesting though is if you release or if you have GnRH being secreted at a constant rate, then you're going to have a little bit of nothing going on. Hold on. Let me go first to this bullet point. Sorry. So FSH released at low frequencies of GnRH. So FSH will. So if GnRH is secreted at low frequencies, it'll tell the anterior pituitary, hey, make FSH. If GnRH is being secreted at, if LH is being released at higher frequencies, that means that GnRH is pulsating a little bit faster. So you need a balance between the two in order to get both FSH and LH, because you need both in order to go through all of the three phases that we talked about. But if you have a GnRH pulse that is happening consistently, so it's not changing in order to produce more or less FSH, then nothing gets released. Freaking crazy. Okay, all right. So this summary slide gives you a good idea of what's going on in each of these, but let's go ahead and take it down one at a time. So this picture in the top left-hand corner, we go through the follicular phase and then mid-cycle, which whatever, you can combine follicular phase with mid-cycle as one feedback loop, and then the luteal phase on the right. So hypothalamus releases GnRH, goes to anterior pituitary, makes FSH and LH. Great, that goes to the ovary. Ovary says, okay, I'm going to make follicles. Cool. The specific cells in the follicle start releasing estrogen or estradiol. Estradiol is just a different chemical structure of estrogen. It's just not quite estrogen yet, but you can call it estrogen, that's fine, or estradiol, whichever you want to call it. You'll get into those specifics in higher courses. Okay, then you get enough estrogen. Estrogen goes back to the anterior pituitary, tells the anterior pituitary, hey, stop, we're good, we don't need it anymore. And it also goes back to the hypothalamus and says, hey, stop, we're good, we don't need it anymore. So negative feedback. What it's showing you here in mid-cycle with those positive feedback loop is it's saying we don't have enough yet, keep going. So I would just focus on the follicular phase if the mid-cycle one confuses you. Then finally in the luteal phase, Once we finally have enough FSH and LH, right, we make that follicle ruptures, you have ovulation, those cells that get left behind finally start producing progesterone. So this is again also coming from the ovary because everything's happening in the ovary here. Progesterone has a negative feedback loop on hypothalamus and anterior pituitary saying, hey, hang out for a bit, we don't need you right now. Let's see if we can have an implantation, and we'll call on you again here in a couple of days. Okay, so here's what's being represented again in the bottom picture. This picture, again, I cropped it from that combined picture that comes from your book that we'll do a video on. And here you can see, let's focus on let's talk about GnRH first, so that's the green line. So you can see it slowly increases, and then by mid-cycle it peaks, and then it rapidly drops off. And so the pulse frequency. So at lower pulse frequencies, we have more FSH being made. At higher pulse frequencies, we have more LH being made. And this is super, super important because what we need is we need what's called an LH surge, which means that you have a stupid amount of LH being made, and so much so that it actually helps promote ovulation. And then once you have so much LH, then that overwhelming amount of LH goes immediately back to the hypothalamus and says, hey, whoa, we're done. No, we don't need you anymore. And then you can finally dip off into the luteal phase. So that's what that graph is representing over here. You have a similar surge with FSH, but it's just not as important as LH. Okay, now let's focus on this picture first. So here we have a picture of a tertiary follicle or a Graafian mature follicle. And I can tell that because I see an antrum and I see a secondary oocyte surrounded by a corona radiata. That's how I can tell that it's a tertiary follicle. And my tertiary follicle is going to have both thecal cells and granulosa cells. And both of those cells are going to be secreting hormones. And now let's move up to, and so I like this picture because it actually shows you where the granulosa and the thecal cells are of a tertiary follicle versus the previous pictures didn't show you that. So that's why I included it in here. Now let's go back up to this top picture here. So anterior pituitary releases FSH and LH, right? Let's focus on LH first. So LH is going to go to the thecal cells, and it says, hey, thecal cells, we need to make estrogen, but the granulosa cells don't have the ability to make the pre-estrogen, but they do have the enzyme to convert that pre-estrogen into final estrogen. So those thecal cells are going to take cholesterol, because remember, cholesterol is a steroid hormone that is a precursor for pretty much everything. It's definitely a precursor for all of our steroid sex hormones. So cholesterol gets converted into what, don't worry about andros, I don't even know how to say that. Don't even worry about that word. It's just pre-estrogen. And that pre-estrogen is going to leave the thecal cells, go to the granulosa cells, and actually finally get converted into estrogen. So you need both. You can't just have one. And I think the purpose for this is to A, make enough, and B, match up with the timing of everything else. So you need a lot of LH and you need a lot of FSH, but things are happening in pulses, right? And so you're kind of spreading yourself thin if you only allow one hormone to make estrogen at once and then allow the other hormone to make estrogen at once, because then you're only making half of the amount that you could potentially make. Instead, having both cells have the capacity to make some sort of estrogen and at least have the capacity to convert it will make you have enough estrogen at the end of the day. So LH goes to the thecal cells only, tells thecal cells make pre-estrogen. That goes to the granulosa cells. Granulosa cells say, okay, cool, I'm going to make estrogen with that, and they pop out estrogen. Also pay attention to this too. So back to this picture. So in the corona radiata, you only really have granulosa cells, sort of, as part of the corona radiata. They're of course everywhere else too in the picture, but they leave with the secondary oocyte, which makes sense because you want the cells that can make estrogen to leave with the oocyte in order to promote production of the functional layer of the endometrium. So that's how I remember that the granulosa cells are closer to the secondary oocyte during the lab practical than the thecal cells. The thecal cells will be more of a supportive surrounding cell, but the granulosa cells are the ones that are actually releasing estrogen, so they have to be close to the secondary oocyte in order to support it on its journey through the uterine tube. Okay, all right. Next video, we will talk about we'll put it all together. We'll put all of this together.